Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying a really beautiful afternoon. Thanks for making time to join us for Tree School Online. I'm really sorry we're not able to meet in the field, but nevertheless, my name's Ryan Gordon, and I'm the Family Forest Land Coordinator with the Oregon Department of Forestry, and I'll be your host this afternoon. Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forestry Education. We want to give special recognition to the Oregon Forest Resources Institute for leading this project, and to the Oregon Department of Forestry and U.S. Forest Service for some of the grant funds that helped to make the webinar series possible. As a reminder, Tree School Online webinars are scheduled every Tuesday from now until July 28th. There are 2 webinars each Tuesday, one at 10 in the morning and the other at 3 in the afternoon. So this afternoon's webinar will be given by Chritine Buhl. Chritine is the entomologist on our forest health team at ODF. And today she's going to be talking about insects in the trees and helping us separate the good from the bad, or the pests from the non-pests. Before I further introduce Chritine and let her get started with the presentation, I do have some housekeeping details I'd like to go through. As you all know, today we're using Zoom to provide this webinar. And of most importance for you is the toolbar, which should be at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, you can scroll your cursor over that area and it should pop up. If you're on another device like an iPad or a phone, the toolbar might be at the top. But most of the features that you'll need today and that we'll be talking about are accessed through the toolbar. Audio is muted for participants, and we'll keep it that way throughout the webinar. Video is also not available. We will, however, be making use of the Q&A function for written questions, which should be posted in the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring it throughout the webinar. So as you think of them, please post your questions there. We'll bin them up and then try to get them answered. We're going to take a little break about halfway through Christine's presentation to address some of those questions, and then we'll field the remaining questions at the end of the presentation. So it's really that Q&A box that is your primary means of communicating with us today. We do, though, also have the chat function, and that's available primarily if you're having any kind of technical issues. The chat box is going to be monitored by today's co-host, Mike Clowesy. Mike's working in the background to help me out. So if you have some technical concerns or issues with Zoom, throw them up in the chat box. But if you've got questions for Chritine, make sure that you're using the Q&A function. Chritine has some really great resources that she's made available for this webinar, and those can be found on the Tree School Online class guide page, which you can easily reach from the knowyourforest.org website. If you click on the webinar description, you'll be taken to an OSU extension website where you can access the resources that are available for each webinar. I also want to highlight that this course qualifies for Pro Logger, Master Gardener, and ODA Pest credits. And if you're interested in getting any of those for participating today, you can access a form which is also available on the class resource page for this class. You'll see a link for a CE credit request form. And in particular, I wanted to note that if you're interested in the ODA credits, be sure that the information you enter in the form matches exactly the information on your applicator's license. As a reminder, these webinars are being recorded and they will be archived as YouTube videos and accessible from the knowyourforest.org website. We're also going to be using some polls during the webinar today. There's going to be one up front and then also an evaluation poll that'll be posted near the end. These polls should pop up automatically on your screen in a box. After you answer the questions, you can close the poll. If for some reason that box doesn't pop up, you don't see the polls, you can check the Zoom toolbar and that poll button should be highlighted. And if it's there, you should be able to click on it and the poll should pop up. So that's all the housekeeping. Now let's go ahead and get started with the webinar. Once again, today's presenter is Chritine Buhl. She's the state forest entomologist with the Oregon Department of Forestry. Chritine is a graduate of Oregon State University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She served as an entomologist from Hawaii to Lebanon in projects spanning from public health to chemical ecology. And in her current role at ODF, she provides statewide technical assistance to public and private landowners and monitors forest health via aerial and ground surveys. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Chritine. Thanks for joining us today, and I'm going to let you give a little introduction, and then we'll jump in with that first poll.
Great, thank you, Ryan. So today we're going to be talking about major forest pests that can be found in our Oregon forests, but I'm also going to acknowledge some pests that might be more aesthetic and maybe not major pests, but you might see on the landscape, just so you're aware of what to do about those as well. I will discuss how to diagnose on your own, what signs and symptoms might be present on your landscape, and talk about general management options, as well as provide you with some resources where you can find more information near the end.
Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead then and launch the first poll. It should pop up on your screens right about now. And we're just trying to collect a little bit of information about who's joining us today. It helps us know who's coming to the webinars, and also helps Chritine think a little bit about some of the information she might share with you. I see folks are getting in there now. I'm just going to let that populate for a minute or two, and then we'll talk through the results. It looks like we have in the neighborhood of about 55 participants or so today, and I see the responses are slowing down. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and I will share those results with everybody. So the big question, where are you from? It looks like about 3/4 of you are from the Willamette Valley, and that is very common for these tree school online classes, but we do have folks from actually around the country. We've got 2 folks joining us from outside of Oregon or Washington, 4 from Washington State, and a few from the coast, Southwest and Eastern Oregon. In terms of how you describe yourself, a little over half of you are woodland owners, and around 30% or so, 35% identify as a natural resource professional, and 17% of you, or 8 or so of you, click the other box. And in terms of ownership, for those of you that own and manage woodlands, looks like about 15% have fewer than 10 acres, 30% in that 10 to 40 acre range, and right around 20% between 40 and 1,000 acres, and a fair number of people who've answered more than 1,000 acres. I'm guessing that some of those might be some of the natural resource professionals who are joining us today. So I'm going to close these up, and Chritine, I will invite you to turn your camera back on, and I'll get out of the way so you can give the presentation. And you are on mute. Yep.
Okay, great. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to run through the most common pests that we find in Oregon. I will give a nod to a few that maybe don't occur on the west side, even though the majority of you are from the west side of Oregon, just because they are important pests as well, just to be aware of. But the majority of the pests that we're going to talk about and other insects are going to be situated on the west side of Oregon. So the one biggest takeaway that I want you to leave this class with is understanding that for the most part, a lot of these insects are not directly pests in terms of being direct tree killers. They're secondary. They are taking advantage of a situation in which you have one or many trees that are already a little bit stressed, because these trees that we have, especially our conifers, are well defended. They are able to protect themselves with a mechanical barrier or a chemical barrier and prevent insects from actually entering the tree or doing much damage. But once they are experiencing a little bit of stress, the first thing to fail are defenses, because all of those resources are going primarily towards the growth of that tree and for that tree to stay alive, not going towards very energy expensive defenses such as chemical defenses. So even though many of you are already aware of the many different things that can occur to damage trees or stress trees, it bears mentioning them again, just because it's something that should always be in the back of your mind when you assess a site. What do you see going on there? Rather than zeroing in and looking specifically for insects. The biggest concern I get is, I've got beetles in my tree, what's killing my tree? That's not what you need to be thinking. When you go into a site, you need to look at the site as a whole, holistically, try and determine if you see some other factors there, rather than just zeroing in on the insect. Very rarely is it the insect that's causing the problem. So I'm just gonna run through some of these bullets of some stressful situations. So poor or inappropriate location for a tree species or cultivar. So for example, we have a ponderosa on the east side, but on the west side of the state, we have Willamette Valley pine, which is more tolerant to more moist conditions. And so you wouldn't want to switch those two, even though they're the same species, they are planted in those places for a reason. So you wouldn't want to plant an east side ponderosa on the west side in the Willamette Valley, or a valley pine on the east side. They're just not going to fare as well. Can they live? Sure, but they're going to be a little bit more stressed. Poor or inappropriate site quality is a big one. If you have soils that are a little too rocky or maybe too boggy, they have a little bit too much moisture holding potential in the soil, that's going to be problematic. Or if you have trees that are planted right next to roadways, sidewalks, etc., that's a lot of traffic that's going over those routes. And so that tree is going to be inherently a bit more stressed than a tree that's out in an area where it doesn't have that exposure. Drought and waterlogging are big, in particular drought. We have been a drought since 2012, and I'm going to share more details about what do we actually consider drought, what does it do, because that is a huge precursor to insect damage. And we have seen a lot of that fallout from the drought starting in 2012 each year, and we will continue to see it even in years where we get a bit more moisture, such as we have this year. Competition, and that's competition between trees, but also with other plants in the understory that could be native or invasives. Even grasses sometimes can provide enough competition, especially for resources such as moisture. And mechanical and chemical injury. It's really common to see after a harvest any sort of nicks or damage to the boles of the tree from the equipment that's traveling through, or some of the vehicles. And you ignore that because the trees will withstand it, they'll heal over, they'll be fine. But what's happened is you've created an opening, and a lot of different things can come in that way. Insects can burrow their way in without that opening, but any sort of fungus, any spores that are flying through the air, that can enter in that way. And it's just inherently going to make that tree a little bit weaker than maybe the tree right next to it that did not have that damage. Fire, ice, wind, and other environmental damage, anything that's breaking the tops off, breaking off some branches, or just stressing the foliage of the tree, will predispose the tree to insect damage. And there are specific instances in which insects are more attracted to trees that are damaged, for example, by wind. So we will talk about blowdown being an issue for some types of bark beetles. So it's a very attractive tree to get into. Prior vertebrate, insect, or pathogen damage, because it's an additive effect that if you have damage one year, for example, if you have a defoliating insect that takes all the leaves off of the tree that attacks one year, but the next year you have some needles come back, well, that tree is going to be a bit more stressed, and bark beetles tend to favor that, and they'll go after and hit a tree. So where we see a footprint of a defoliator outbreak, we often will see bark beetles attacking that same area, maybe the next year or two. And then old age and low vigor. It happens to us all. We get older, and so do trees, and they get to a point where they're just not performing as well, and they are more susceptible to all of these stressors, including insects. So the main takeaway is, when you have stressed trees, you have susceptible trees. So improve the resiliency, the health, the quality of the site and the trees. You're going to prevent a lot of insect damage, and it's going to be way more cost effective and more efficacious as a whole, rather than trying to just treat the insect as an after fact, because that's often a band-aid solution. So let's start off with drought, because this is a major predisposing factor that we're dealing with when we talk about insect damage that's in proportions that is unusual to what we've seen historically. It's because we have a whole glut of trees that are drought stressed, and so it's just this attractive food buffet for these insects that are taking advantage of it. So what this map is showing you is 30 years all the way through 2019. And so all of the bars are showing total precipitation each year, and this is statewide. And so all of those blue bars are the total precip. And then if you want to look for the 30-year average, that's the dotted blue line that's running through it. So you can see, starting in 2012, we actually had a lot of moisture, but it wasn't the type of moisture that we need. And I'll explain a little bit more about that when we talk about defining what is drought. It's not record highs or record lows. It's the duration, the timing. That's very important. So 2012, we maybe didn't have enough moisture distributed throughout the year, but we had big storm events or big snow events, but they were very short, or the timing wasn't correct. So maybe not getting the winter precipitation that creates snowpack, but we would get some moisture maybe in early spring, and that was it. So we were still below the average for precipitation in 2013, 2015, 2018, and 2019. That is a string of drier times that's very stressful to trees. And they don't really like to bounce back and forth, getting a lot of moisture, not enough moisture. It kind of confuses their systems. And so additionally, temperature is playing a leading role. And so in the So let me pick up where I left off with the average temperature. So the unbroken red line is annual average temperature. So it's the full average of all the different temperatures we experience throughout the year for the past 30 years. So each year. And the broken line is the 30-year average. So again, let's look back to 2012, and you can see we're right on the average, riding that through 2013. But again, remember, just because we are at that average, it doesn't mean that that's ideally where we want to be, because it's the number of days in a row that maybe have higher temperatures rather than just record highs or lows. But you can see, starting 2013 to 2014, we are well above the average, staying above there until 2016. And again, we bumped back up in 2018. So this combination of having warmer temperature, lower precipitation, and the timing of that is very important in stressing a tree. So here are some resources that are really useful to keep track of what the weather and what the weather is doing, but also to monitor climate over time. So as I mentioned, the definition of drought is not just having record high temperatures or record low amounts of precipitation. It's how much time are we going without precipitation? Do we have 2 weeks in the middle of the summer in which there's no rain and the temperatures are very high? That's going to be more impactful in damaging a tree versus having one really hot day and then we get a few days of rain and cooler temperatures after that day. So that consistency or inconsistency of temperature and precipitation is really important. Additionally, we may get a lot of precipitation one year if you look at averages or totals, but what form is that in? Is it in snowpack in the winter, or is it just rain that washes right through? Trees need a long, slow soak with watering. So we need snowpack because it recharges waterways as it slowly thaws. and it will also water the adjacent trees in our mountainous areas. That's really important versus having one heavy rain that just washes through very quickly. That's too quick for trees to be able to slowly soak that water up. So timing is very important. The type of precipitation is very important. So ways you can keep track of it, I highly suggest if you follow the link at the bottom, and there is a Word document that is being shared with you as well that has all of these links on it. So you don't have to write these down as you watch the video. It's in the additional resources. So they will all be provided there. But this is a drought report that you subscribe to the email, and every month you get the drought monitor that's conducted by the state. And it not only will give you a nice little summary in the first page, so you don't have to read a whole long document. It's just a couple paragraphs to give you kind of a summary of what the temperature is doing, what precipitation is doing statewide. But then if you want to focus on specific parts of the state, it will give you a breakdown from that as well. So it is one of the most useful products I've seen for monitoring drought issues. There are also various maps, such as the one that I pulled up here from West-Wide Drought Tracker, in which you can make maps that span the whole year, the last month. You can zero into different parts of the state, and they break it down very clearly so that you can see what the averages are in those time spans. So let's look at those maps. So in the one on the left, that's temperature, and this is statewide for 2019. So you will see that we are much above normal or above normal. So we're yellow or orange in most parts of the west side of the state. So it's been pretty dry on west of the Cascades. And then in the precipitation map to the right, you can see we've also been below normal or much below normal in the precipitation side. Now, you realize in 2020, we have experienced more rain than we have in previous years, which is great, but it does take more than 1 year for trees to bounce back from a good level or returning back to average precipitation. So realize that we're not out of the woods, and it's not being predicted that the high temperatures and drought periods are going away anytime soon. I hesitate to say it's the new normal because we don't know, but the track record so far is showing a trend of increasing temperatures and decreasing precipitation and more erratic precipitation. So we can expect a bit more of that in the future, and we should plan for that accordingly. So how does drought directly impact the trees? So the two main things that it's killing is the vascular system and the roots. So the vascular system, what transports water and nutrients, it's cutting those off. So basically, once those, I think I'm about to lose my connection again. So I'll slow down here. Okay, maybe not. Okay, so I'll keep going. So the vascular system, it's what's delivering the water and the nutrients throughout the tree. When you have drought, some of those tubes, they actually will form bubbles. So it's cavitation that's happening, and you'll form little vascular embolisms, because basically, think of it in terms of a straw that you're trying to suck up a milkshake, and it's so thick, it's hard to get it to come up through that straw. And sometimes the straw will fail. You might have a little hole in the side of the straw, and so that milkshake cannot get all the way up because the suction is now gone. That's what's happening in the vascular tissue. The pull is so strong to pull that moisture up through the roots throughout the tree that those tubes that bring it up actually break. And once they break, they can't simply be rebuilt. They need to be replaced, and that takes time, and it also takes resources. So that's why you see trees that have been droughted 1 year, for example, but they may die in year 2, 3, or 5, because it takes time for those trees to realize that they've lost their potential to translocate water. And also it takes time for them to rebuild those tissues so that even if moisture does come along within that span of time, they are not able to pull it up without those tissues. Same thing goes with the roots. So root systems often die back, especially the fine roots, which are really important for pulling in some of the micronutrients and moisture. And so that will die back in a tree. And so even though you might get a whole flush of rain the next year, there aren't enough roots to absorb it. So these are long-term issues when you have drought stress. And as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, the first thing to be affected is defenses. So the tree's primary focus is growth. And so any sort of loss of resources immediately will go towards getting rid of defenses and focusing on growth. That is most important to keep the tree alive. So then when you have insects that come along, they can take advantage of that fact. And so I want you to be aware of also our most drought intolerant trees. I think sometimes we forget because we see things like Doug fir in areas where it's a little bit drier. There are different cultivars and different genotypes that can withstand a little bit drier conditions. But for the most part, the Western red cedar is most at drought or neck and neck with our true fir, such as grand and noble fir. Next, we have Douglas fir, which is slightly more drought tolerant than the other species. And then the far end of that spectrum is ponderosa pine and things like Oregon white oak, which are very drought tolerant. So what I always tell people is just because you have dry conditions that may be persisting, realize you might have parts of the landscape that you own or manage that you might want to avoid planting things like Douglas fir and Western red cedar because there are drier patches. And there you can allocate valley pine, white oak, even things like incense cedar or other drought tolerant trees. And then in the warmer or the more moist zones or cooler zones of your landscape, you can actually try to retain some Douglas fir and Western red cedar. So you really need to read your land, look at these climate reports, look at the weather reports, and make those decisions for the long term. Okay, so let's get into insects. So I really like to start with a heavy base on drought because we've just seen it so much in recent history, and it's really impacting a lot of what we see on the landscape. So when I typically see the bark beetle outbreaks, it's in areas that are most drought stressed. So it's a 1-2 relationship. But first, being an entomologist that doesn't hate insects, I do want to promote the ecosystem services that they provide, and we need to take a more holistic approach and thought process in our management decisions because they are there for a reason. And if removed from a system, you might have more factors that were involved with that insect than you realize, and that's going to be really impactful. So a light touch is definitely preferred in managing for insects. They serve as natural enemies. They're predators and they're parasites. We have a lot of like parasitic wasps, for example, that manage a lot of different insects. And it is very common to see, for example, forests that are bordering orchards where a lot more pesticides might be used over the longer term rather than just in the establishment of trees, that the natural enemy populations are far lower. And so then that's affecting adjacent forest lands. So you'll just have fewer of these parasitic wasps and predators on the landscape to control pests naturally. And so pest issues, especially right adjacent to orchards, tend to be a bit higher. So those are unintended consequences. They are prey for wildlife. So any of you that are managing for wildlife, we do want to keep them on the landscape as food. They are providing the decomposition and nutrient cycling process that includes some of the wood-boring beetles that I will talk about that come in and damage some stressed trees or dying trees that are already on their way out. This is the first step in breaking that material down and returning those nutrients back into the system. So very important. And then this is a little controversial, but they also provide selective removal of less vigorous trees. So bark beetles come in, they're going to go after the most stressed trees. You don't want those on your landscape anyway. You would like those removed so that the healthier trees can actually benefit the most from all the resources that are available, and those are going to be the ones that persist. So sometimes it's not as selective or more selective than we would like, but they are doing that service. And some are just a little bit cute. So we do want to keep some of them around. So I'm going to lay out a few scenarios in which insects will present a problem. So almost all of the insects I'm going to talk about today are native, and they're present in sometimes larger numbers on the landscape, but they really only present a problem when you have a situation that they could take advantage of. It's kind of like if you provide a whole buffet of food, more people are going to come to the party and they're going to eat a lot. It's the same deal with some of these pest insects. So anytime you have stress conditions such as widespread drought, damage from storms, for example, or fire, then you're going to have a pest issue usually following on the heels of that. How long that condition persists depends on what's the health of that stand. So you have that initial stress factor, but once a lot of those trees are taken out in that first year, in subsequent years, the pest may simply go away, the outbreak may collapse because the general health of the remaining trees is pretty good. So some insects have cyclical outbreaks, which it's not determined by the weather, climate, or any other conditions. It's just they're biologically predetermined to outbreak every, let's say, 10 to 15 years, for example. So that can't be prevented. And usually the sites in which these insects occur in are pretty used to that scenario, and so they can rebound pretty easily. But some trees might be a little bit more stressed due to, for example, a complicating factor such as drought. So fewer trees would make it than otherwise. Next, this is kind of regarding the example that I laid out earlier with a lack of natural controls. So having a pine stand in the gorge next to a cherry orchard, you're going to have inherently fewer parasitic wasps due to the chemical control utilized in the orchard, and that's going to have secondary effects on the conifers that are hosting pests that those parasitic wasps were controlling. Invasive species is also another one. We do have periodic outbreaks of invasive species that have been established here, but because we don't have natural controls that are focusing on them, they're just generalists, these outbreaks may persist for a little bit longer. So these are the forest insect groups that I'm going to run through. So the bark beetles are the biggest one. They are the smallest insect, but they're a pretty large group, and they are the most impactful group because they're very opportunistic. They can really detect chemically when there are trees that they want to feed on nearby, trees that are stressed or of the species that they require. They zero in and then they communicate to each other chemically to bring more in to overcome the defenses of that tree. So they are pretty effective tree killers as direct tree killers, but they do still focus on the more stressed trees. And when they attack, they can girdle a tree, so they can cut off the vascular tissues by creating their galleries, and they can introduce fungal stains, which can also clog those vascular tissues. Next, we have the wood-boring insects. This includes beetles, but also there are some moth larvae. Usually they're pretty big, flashy insects, and I get a lot of calls about these because when you see a beetle as big as that one in the image crawling out of a tree, you tend to worry. But for the most part, these are the first stage of decomposition in a tree. They come in only when a tree is highly stressed, or you might just have one or two in a tree that's still thriving and it's not going to kill the tree. I will note the exceptions to this, that we have a couple that we are worried about, and so I will note those. Next, we have defoliators. This includes moth and butterfly larvae, sawfly larvae, and beetle adults and larvae. They will eat the leaves. Some will spin silk, so they can be kind of obvious. They make webbing in the crown. For the most part, on the west side, a lot of the defoliators that we have are attacking hardwoods, which is not as problematic because hardwoods will drop their leaves every year, so they're not as impacted versus a conifer that needs to retain at least 2 to 3 years worth of needles. And so losing 1 year of needles is far more impactful. But I will note some of the ones we have on the west side, but luckily we do not have to deal with tussock moth, Pandora moth, pine butterfly, western spruce budworm, all insects you may have heard of on the east side of the Cascades. Next, we have the sap-sucking insects. So if you think about aphids that you find on your roses, they just kind of settle down there and stay for a long time, sucking out those juices. and then the foliage kind of turns yellow, and then it will drop. These guys are doing the same thing. Adelgids are simply an aphid that attacks conifers. Sometimes they have some white cottony fluff covering their bodies. And then scales, and that's what this image is, are harder bodied insects that also settle down on foliage and stay there for their lifetime. And they're feeding on the sap, and so that's removing nutrients. Some of them in that feeding will also inject enzymes that will irritate the tissues of the plant and create galls. So they'll have these kind of lumpy looking tissues. So let's get into the bark beetles. So they're very small. They're about the size of a grain of rice or the head of a matchstick. They are opportunistic, so they do like to take advantage of a tree that's already stressed or already dying. Some are eruptive, where they can outbreak. So because I mentioned they are so successful in their chemical signaling, they can become eruptive. And the typical process is that a bark beetle species can smell the type of tree they're looking for. So as an example, Douglas fir beetle prefers Douglas fir. It can smell the green leaf volatiles that come off of that tree to make it smell like a Doug fir. Once they get into that tree, they might smell if it's stressed. Does it have a higher level of ethanol, for example, that's releasing to note that it's stressed? And there are other chemicals that they can also detect from stressed trees. Then an insect will burrow in. If it makes it through unscathed, there's no sap to push it out as a mechanical barrier and also a chemical barrier. It will create a gallery. And at the bottom right, there is an image of a gallery. It's kind of a multi-lined web-like structure that varies by the beetle species, but they will make that same pattern every time. They'll dig in. If they're successful, then they will call for a mate. So they release a chemical pheromone that attracts one or more mates. They may also attract other of their same species that can help overcome the tree's defenses. So if a tree gets mass attacked, it's going to want to try and push out more sap and more sap. But if you have a certain number of insects that overwhelm the potential for sap to be ejected from that tree, then those insects have taken over the defenses of the tree and they're that much more successful. From there, they will send out a repellent pheromone so that they don't get overpopulated, because when there isn't enough real estate to go around, then some beetles might not make it because they don't have enough phloem and cambium to feed on, or just enough space for their galleries. And that makes them really effective too, because then they don't basically overwhelm themselves, because that would cause the outbreak to collapse. So they're very adept at using chemical communication to try and find the host, attract a partner, attract more of their same species to try and overcome the tree defenses, and then keep those numbers at a rate that they can withstand any of the tree defenses, but also have enough of that phloem material to feed on. In addition, these insects can vector in fungal stains. Now, these are not rotting stains, so they do not, it's not fungus that breaks down the tissue, but it will clog the vascular tissues, and that hastens tree death because that's reducing any sort of water and nutrient transport. So I'm going to run through some pictures of the diagnosis of bark beetles. If you have a Doug fir or true fir, you may see pitch streams. This is where the beetle is entered, not where it's exiting. So once it enters, you really won't see the hole because they're so tiny or they're hidden in the bark crevice, but sometimes you might see a little bit of pitch that the tree is using to try and push that beetle out. In a pine tree, that pitch forms a tube. It's called a pitch tube, and it's just a little glob of pitch. So those center pictures you can see in the very top one, a beetle got stuck in that pitch tube, and so it died. So it is effective mechanical barrier defense, but also there are chemicals impregnated in the sap that not only repel, but they can also be toxic towards bark beetles, as well as to the fungi that they vector. Next, the frass. So this is probably the most important, because particularly when we have situations such as drought, trees do not produce enough sap because they are low on moisture. And so you may see what are called blind attacks, in which you see no sap produced at all, but you do see piles of reddish brown frass. That's from the beetle burrowing in under the bark. It's not burrowing into the wood, just in the bark, Otherwise, that frass would be white from the wood. It's reddish brown because it's only through the bark, and they're kicking all that frass out from their gallery. And this is usually the first symptom that people see of bark beetle attack. If you delve in a little further, you may see some small exit holes to the far right. This is where they're coming out, looks like a whole bunch of little BB holes. And you can peel the bark back and find the galleries. So on the far left, you see the picture of the galleries etched into the wood, but also underneath the bark. It's primarily going to be created on the interior part of the bark, but sometimes you'll see some etching on the wood as well. You may even see the beetle itself. So the adult, sometimes the larvae or the pupae. And so remember I mentioned bark beetles also can vector fungal stains. So on the left is blue stain or sap stain, which is one of the many different types of fungus that these beetles can carry on their bodies that just clog the vascular tissue. So the staining is not rotting the wood, it's more of an aesthetic effect. Some beetles will also cause woodpecker flecking because the beetle actually is very close to the surface. This is very specific in western pine beetle, attacking only ponderosa pine. You'll see this flecking because those beetles move closer to the outer bark as they pupate, and the woodpeckers can hear them and access them. So just fleck off the bark. So that's an indication you've got a beetle problem. And then lastly, the red needles. Some beetles will cause top kills. So you'll see a third of the tree, the small inset image down there shows a third of the tree has died and the rest will later follow. Sometimes the whole tree dies at once. Once you see red needles, the beetles are typically gone. They've already done their work and they've moved on. It just takes a while for that message to get to the tree that it has died. And the way that these bark beetles work is that anytime you see a red tree, you want to then step it out and look to the green trees right next to that red tree, because they've already left that red tree. They're probably in the green trees right adjacent. They're small. They don't like to fly far. They'll go to the next closest tree that doesn't have strong defenses to try and push them out. So that's very important to try to delineate where your pest problem occurs. Additionally, once these bark beetles have hit a tree and they've killed it, they're not going to keep attacking that tree. So that red tree is not going to be attacked in year 2 or 3. The beetles are done. They like a living tree. They do not like to attack a dead tree, but they do like to attack a tree that's kind of not super healthy. Okay, so now I'm going to go through a few individual species that are more problematic bark beetle pests. We have many species of bark beetles, but only a handful are actually pests in that they are major tree killers. So Douglas fir beetle is a big one on the west side. And the scenario in which it's most problematic is when you have a harvest operation in which you leave the logs on the ground for a long period of time, or if you have a blowdown event, because what these beetles really like is large diameter Douglas fir, and they will go after trees that are stressed but still fresh and alive. And so when you have cut a tree or there's blowdown, that tree, it just died, it's still fresh, but the defenses are very low because it's effectively dead. And so the beetles really hone in on that and will attack. Luckily, we do have a really great management option for Douglas fir beetle that we don't have for other beetles, in that we can apply this product called MCH. And what this is an anti-aggregation pheromone. And so remember I mentioned that bark beetles actually produce a repellent pheromone that say, nope, no vacancy, we don't have enough real estate for you here. That's what this product is. It's MCH that's synthetically produced by us. And you will just staple it to your trees. It's a little pouch, and it only speaks to Douglas fir beetle, and it repels. And so you lay it out in a grid, and we have a fact sheet about that on our website. But typically it's about 30-foot to 60-foot spacing. It depends on how many pouches you put on a tree. You just step them out, forming a grid, and it forms a cloud over the area that the beetle doesn't even like. And so what it does is not only can they not burrow into a tree because it smells bad to them, they will try the next tree and the next tree. And so what this does is it tires them out because they have limited fat stores. They can't just keep flying around, or it disperses them on the landscape. So it's a really effective tool. So anytime you have a blowdown event or a harvest event, you want to ideally remove those logs before the next April, because that's when these beetles will start flying and attacking. If you don't apply or remove those logs, you could put out the MCH, or you can wait until the 2nd April, because the beetle will get into that down material that first year, and then the adults will die. Their offspring that they just created will develop that whole next year, and they will leave that material that next April. So the 2nd April, after those trees have been laid on the ground, they'll then leave to attack the standing trees. So you really have before the 1st or the 2nd April, after a tree is felled, to apply MCH or remove logs. And while you're at it, you might as well remove any trees that are already a little stressed, because those will be the first ones that these beetles will attack once they leave the down material. Also, what's really essential for a lot of beetles is managing root rot. Anytime you have a root rot pocket, that's very attractive to bark beetle outbreaks. So here's that MCH. The cost is about $80 to $100 an acre. And like I said, you lay it out in a grid. It also can be applied as a flake from an aerial application, but obviously with increased cost. And the most efficacious way to utilize MCH is to do the treatments I mentioned, also removing the down material or stress trees as well, rather than just applying MCH. But even if you just apply MCH, it's far better than having done nothing. Next, we have fur engraver, which is a bark beetle that attacks true fir. And the first symptom is typically the top third of the tree turns red, and then the rest of the tree during that year will turn red. Oftentimes you'll see bark that's been removed, and you see all these horizontal lines as in the middle picture. And that's the gallery that fur engraver makes. And it's once you see it, you can't unsee it. It is very clear, clearly defined, easy to see. And oftentimes what's happening is the bark is removed because the woodpeckers can hear those beetles under the bark. Fur tends to be a little bit thinner skinned, and so they will hear them and they'll start pecking at them, and then the bark just sloughs off and you see the galleries underneath. Now, fur engraver is actually not a huge tree killer because they form these small galleries, and because the orientation of the gallery, they don't cut across a lot of resin canals, but they cut across enough that they get flooded, that trees can often heal over these galleries. And that picture to the left is actually defect from a gallery that was formed years past, and the tree withstood that and covered it over. So while there is defect, it's not largely affecting growth, and it did not kill the tree. But when you have a large number of fur engraver, they can overcome the tree's defenses, attack in large number, and then it's just too many galleries and too many individuals that the tree cannot withstand it with their defenses. And so we often see this during periods of drought, or where we have true fir growing in drier sites, rocky sites, south-facing slopes, or where there are root rot pockets. So again, manage for the health of the tree, you prevent insects such as this. Next, we're moving into the pine attacking bark beetles. And so Ips bark beetles, and there's a picture at the top right, they have spines on the back end of their wings. If you look very closely, you can see these little spiny structures, but they're very small beetle. They differ from a lot of our other bark beetles in that they can develop within 2 months. So because they have that fast development, they can hit a lot of trees each year. So they tend to be a bit more damaging. Additionally, they like to develop in smaller diameter material. So they really like slash. Anytime an operation takes place in which the slash is not destroyed in a specific period of time, the Ips will develop in the slash, and then their offspring will spread to the adjacent trees. Now, this is very common in the Willamette Valley to have valley pine stocked at a high level, because there really isn't a market right now to do a pre-commercial thin. And so what you'll have is this highly stocked young stand. So it's just a pile of small diameter pine. While we're waiting for the market to improve, they don't get thinned out. They start out competing each other, then throw in drought in there. And those pine are really stressed, but also very attracted to these beetles because they like a whole bunch of small diameter trees. So they'll come in and then you'll have a growing pocket of mortality. It'll start with just a handful of trees in one area, and then it will spread out from that tree, because remember, bark beetles, they don't like to fly very far. So they'll just step out to the next adjacent tree if possible. And these insects will make an X or a Y-shaped gallery under the bark. But the best way to manage for this, for pine, is obviously to thin these young stands. And anytime you do any work, destroying the 3 to 8 inch diameter slash. So that's the tops, that's the branches. They can get into the larger boles, but they tend not to, because they like the thinner bark, small diameter portions. And ways you can manage for that slash material is if you actually lay the material on the ground October through December, it will dry up and be unusable for them come April when they start flying. If you step outside that window, such as if you lay slash material on the ground in February, that's only a couple of months and that material is still fresh, and the beetles will want to attack it in April. So if you're outside of that window, you definitely want to burn, chip, masticate, any way you can destroy that slash material. So this is that IPS outbreak cycle. It's very common for me to see a whole bunch of slash. It gets attacked by the beetle. You'll see some of this frass starting to form. Sometimes you'll see a pitch tube, but they're very small if they're even present. And next you'll start seeing the top third of the tree die, and then the whole tree. And they'll attack any species of pine. And the outbreaks tend to continue for about 2 to 3 years, depending upon the site conditions. Next, we have mountain pine beetle, and I'm going to go through this quickly because we don't have these on the west side in high number. It's mostly an east side pest and really problematic in dense lodgepole stands, although they will attack any other species of pine. We have all these lodgepole areas that are just dog-haired, have not been thinned. They've come in through areas that have had a lot of fire suppression, so they just get really overstocked, and the mountain pine beetle will take advantage of that fact. Now, there is a product called verbenone that's very similar to the anti-aggregation pheromone MCH that we use for Doug fir beetle, but verbenone only works for mountain pine beetle and only in pure lodgepole stands. And even then, it's about a 50% chance it will work. So I often tell people, don't waste your money on verbenone treatments. You're better off thinning out your lodgepole. And remember, anytime you are doing any sort of management work for mountain pine beetle, or as I'm going to go into western pine beetle, another pine attacking beetle, always think in the back of your mind to manage for IPS as well, because they will get into the slash of any pine that you're doing work in. So here's western pine beetle. Again, not a huge issue on the west side. It mainly attacks ponderosa pine, and you'll see that flecking of the bark. And they really like overgrown ponderosa. So a lot of kind of larger trees that are out competing each other, that tends to be favored by western pine beetle. And next, I'm just going to mention red turpentine beetle because it's very common to see in pine, especially where you have other bark beetles. So it can be an indicator that you have other bark beetles, but red turpentine is not a major tree killer. It's only telling you your tree has been attacked, or there's fire damage, or it's really, really struggling. And the symptoms that you would see would be the pitch tube near the base, and usually they're pretty large. And then right below, if you see in this image, right below the pitch tube, there are all these little crumbly looking particles that kind of look like grape nuts. That's the frass. So it's not powdery like you see in other bark beetles. And that frass is very obvious. You'll notice there's something a little odd. So here's very general bark beetle management. Obviously thinning. Any sort of reduction in density, especially during droughts, is the most important thing you can do. That also includes removing competition by weeds or other trees. While you're at it, removing struggling, sick, or damaged trees. You want to leave fewer trees that are healthier trees rather than more trees that are all struggling. Diversification of tree species is helpful because it breaks up the smell. So if you have a whole bunch of Doug fir in one area versus some pine intermixed there, that pine could confuse Doug fir beetle, for example. So having a mixture can be helpful. And then lastly, managing the pine slash in your pine stands. So let's go through if bark beetles are still present here. So in the far left, you see exit holes. And you see woodpecker flecking of the bark or red needles. No, typically the bark beetles have already left once you see those symptoms. Okay, so here's a question break. So I'm going to look for my chat
We have,
box here.
I can help to kind of run through them if you'd
That'd be
like. We
great.
have yeah, we've got about 6 or so of them in there, and I do want to be mindful of time to make sure we get through the materials, so we might leave some to answer later. But I'll throw a few out for you, Christine. The first one, we'll give it a shot. I think a site visit might help with this one, but the scenario is a 100-plus-year-old hemlock has died, and the assumption is that it probably had a pretty established root system that was growing within 30 feet of a creek, but an upstream channel or canal, I guess, has been constructed and is diverting water away from that creek, potentially drying things out. And so I think the person asking the question is curious if perhaps the diversion of the water, the drying of the soil could have contributed, and if there's any good way to be able to measure the impact of less water coming down through that creek.
Yeah, that's a great example. So luckily in hemlock, we do not have any major bark beetle pests. Those would be the ones that would be attacking, especially if it's a little drought stress. So we do have bark beetles that attack hemlock, but only when the hemlock are pretty close to dead anyway. So that's not a concern, but there is direct impact that if you are diverting water, even if there's the stream is still flowing nearby, it's still a lesser amount of water than that hemlock was getting previous. And so that's definitely going to have an impact, and the tree is feeling it. So there could be direct drought stress that is occurring. You might also have, because hemlock is susceptible to some root and stem diseases, and so you may have some of that on site that are also stressing the tree, but it would not be an insect caused issue. Ways that you can determine if it's moisture level, there are soil moisture probes that could be put at the site. They're relatively cheap that you can kind of monitor, but you don't really have a starting point before that water was diverted to see how much it dropped. But I'm willing to bet anytime you change any sort of irrigation scenario or access to water, even if it's enough water for the tree to survive, it was less than it had been used to getting. And so that's going to send it into a drought stress situation.
Great. Sounds like you got it done without the site visit.
Yeah.
So next question is again kind of thinking about your description of stress and what's causing stress. The person is curious about the impact of harvest and in particular clear cutting. Does that cause a stress condition, and could it potentially increase?
Yes. Yes. So, and you know, any sort of dramatic or drastic action is going to change the environment to the tree. And so when you have, let's say you have a clear cut situation, I'm assuming they mean a stress situation to the leaf trees. So when you clear cut an area, one, you've risked leaving those trees more exposed to any sort of wind events because you've reduced a barrier around them. You've increased sun exposure, so there are issues like sun scald. You've also increased exposure if you have a cold winter, that frost cracks could occur because they're more exposed. So that's to the leaf trees. If you are talking about clear cutting and is that site then still good for replanting, for example, sometimes that high sun exposure can be a little bit damaging, but that is very short term if it's being replanted. So hopefully I've answered what the main emphasis of that question was.
Yeah, and a couple others I'm going to try to kind of string together. There is a question here about are there bait plants like in gardening or other things that you can plant to try to attract pests away from your trees? And then also someone asking, because you talked about MCH, someone asking if you would suggest doing that applying that as a sort of a preventative measure, even if there's no sign of beetles.
Okay, so I'm going to actually, I'm going to answer the second one first. So I would not waste your money on doing that, because you always are going to have, if you have Doug fir, you're always going to have Doug fir beetle on site. It is a natural native part of our system, and you should not try and repel it. It would be a waste of your time and money to do so. I would really only apply it when it's needed. It's really not necessary. Now, with that being said, if you have a couple of heritage trees right next to a structure, or really old trees that you just really want to retain, it doesn't hurt to put out, you know, a few packets on a tree, just to fully protect that tree. That it buys you a bit of insurance, but I would not advise regularly putting out MCH. It's just not really worth your effort in doing so. And in regards to, I should mention, so we don't really have trap plants, because the beetles I mentioned, for example, they are very specific to what they want to feed on. So a Doug fir beetle is not even going to want to visit a fir, a true fir. It's going to want to go for Doug fir. With that being said, there are some secondary trees that they might be interested in. They'll taste them, but they don't really want to develop in them on the larger scale. So there definitely are not herbaceous plants or even shrubby plants that they're going to go after, because it's very specific what they're looking for, and they're not roaming around to nibble on plants. They are specifically going in to feed on the phloem and cambium, and specifically of those host species. So there really aren't trap plants that you can utilize. You can utilize, for example, in the Ips example, they like slash material. You can attract them to the slash and then burn that slash if you time it properly. That can be dangerous, because if you wait a little too long and you run into a no burn period, then you basically created a big trap for beetles that you created a rearing facility for the beetles. So it can be dangerous to do that unless you really work out the timing. There are some trapping mechanisms if you actually want to put out like ethanol traps, but you would have to apply those at a very large scale, and that would be very expensive. And large scale meaning a lot of traps on the landscape. And oftentimes beetles, they're more tuned into what the plants are putting out versus a trap. So the ethanol that we synthetically put into a trap versus the ethanol coming from a tree is going to be far less attractive from a trap than from a tree. So you just can't compete.
Couple more slash management, and then we probably better get back to the presentation. I'm just stringing a few questions together, and the general question is, you know, what are some of the alternatives, or what are some of the options for treating slash? You know, is wood chipping good, or does that promote the beetles or encourage them to come in? Or what about cutting some of the slash up into firewood?
Yeah. So with the slash material, I want to be very clear, it's not legal to apply any pesticide on the slash material. So don't try that. And as I mentioned, chipping and burning are the preferred methods. And you can leave the slash on the ground, like I said, October through December, and that's pretty safe. That come April, the beetles won't want it. But outside of that, chipping and burning, and you want to get it, if you're chipping, you want to chip it pretty small. These beetles can reproduce in as little as 2 inches material, but they're not going to produce a ton of little 2-inch galleries and create an outbreak. So any sort of chipping to break that material up is going to be beneficial. If you want to keep it nearby for kindling, because it is small diameter, it's going to be attractive to the insect. So I would not advise keeping it around. You often see people cut up pine and then they'll stack it up next to pine trees, and that's just creating a beetle salad bar. Do not do that. When you do chip or masticate any sort of breaking of the material, you are, yes, releasing those attractive smells that the beetles like, but those smells dry out very quickly. And so even though it might increase the number of beetles in the immediate area, it's never been attributed to causing more tree death, because they usually get there, they see that they cannot develop in the slash, and then they just kind of scatter on the landscape. So I would definitely not be afraid of releasing those smells, because your ultimate goal is you really want to chip that slash as soon as possible.
Great. Well, I think on the note of beetle salad bars, we should probably get back to the presentation. We've got
Okay.
about 25 minutes left in the session, and we'll return. We can do a little overtime Q&A at the end as well. So thanks. Keep the good questions coming.
Great. Okay, so we have 3 other groups to work through, but I spent a lot of time in drought on bark beetles because those are the most pressing factors historically, currently, and will be in the future. The remainder of these are not as pressing, so they're going to be quite a bit shorter. So the wood-boring insects is the next group. And I really want to distinguish the difference between bark beetles and wood-boring beetles in particular, because they do have different symptoms. So bark beetles will have the reddish brown frass because they only bore into the bark. Wood-boring beetles will have the white frass because they actually bore into the wood. They start out in the bark and then they get into the wood. So white frass, wood-boring beetle, and I tend to tell people, if you see white frass, don't worry about it. That tree is already on its way out, versus red frass, you've got a problem that could cause an outbreak. Also, the size of the holes is really important. Bark beetles are always small. They are always the size of a grain of rice. Wood-boring beetles can be various sizes. They can also be as small as a bark beetle, but often they are much larger. Sometimes they have round exit holes. Sometimes they have oval exit holes. So there's a difference there in those pictures to the right in the sizes of the exit holes. And also what I have circled in the bottom right, I circled in red the bark beetle larvae, and you can see how small those are relative to the big white larvae to the left. That is a wood-boring beetle larva. So these are some really common wood borers that I get a lot of calls about because they are usually pretty large. Some look a little freaky with their long antennae, and they make sounds, little chirping and clicking sounds. And sometimes they land on your skin and they might give you a little bite because they want to see if you're a tree. But these beetles are not pests. These are not ones that need to be managed for. They're active and present on every landscape. And in fact, one of the really large beetles at the bottom right, they're about the size of the palm of your hand. The jaws of that beetle was actually where the design for the chainsaw teeth layout came from, because they saw how effectively this beetle could chew right through the wood. And so they laid out the first pattern for chainsaw design based on the pattern of the little teeth on the mandibles of the beetle. So don't say they didn't do anything for you. Now I'm going to pull out a couple of the wood borers that are problematic that we do want to manage for or be aware of. One is the flat-headed fir borer, which is native. It's one of our very few native tree-killing wood borers, and it only attacks Douglas fir. Oftentimes, it will only attack Douglas fir that is heavily fire damaged or heavily drought stressed. So even though it is a major tree killer, it still is secondary. It cannot attack and kill a living, healthy tree. One of the major symptoms that you'll see from attack from this beetle is you will see flecking of the bark, because they also will pupate closer to the outer bark. And so you'll see a woodpecker flecking off the outer bark of a Douglas fir, and then you want to start thinking of flat-headed fir borer. So in terms of management, be cautious of where you're planting your Doug fir. If you're in a site in which oak and pine seem to be thriving, a lot of areas in like Douglas County, for example, on through Jackson, Josephine, there are a lot of dry areas in which Doug fir is encroached. In areas that are too dry, and flathead fir borer will take those trees out. Next, we have bronze birch borer, more of an issue in urban landscapes. It is also native. It behaves like an emerald ash borer in that it does not burrow into the wood. It stays under the bark like a bark beetle. So does the flat-headed fir borer I previously mentioned. This is why they are actually tree killers, because they girdle the tree. They just make their galleries underneath the bark in that cambium phloem layer, rather than just diving down into the heartwood, which is not really functioning any longer. And so bronze birch borer will almost always be attacking birch that is either non-native or in a site that is too dry or too warm, because birch is really more riparian. They like cooler areas, cool soils, more moisture. And so what they'll do is they'll attack the tree, and you'll see a top-down dieback progression, and you'll know you have bronze birch borer. I don't usually advise treatment for this because it's telling you that that tree does not like that site. You should maybe think about a tree that could be there longer term. I should mention with these beetles, bark beetles and wood borers, There are products that can be applied externally on the tree that are preventative, that can kill the tree or repel, or kill the insect or repel the insect, but they are very expensive to apply. You have to apply them to the full tree until runoff wet. They also do not work to kill any insects in the tree. They can only prevent. So they are usually they're only used for heritage trees in park settings or very small scale projects. And even then, they're very rarely used just because they're so expensive and hard to do. Next, the ambrosia beetles. That is a type of wood-boring beetle that is very small, but it behaves just like a wood-boring beetle, even though it's the size of a bark beetle. What's unusual is they don't feed on wood. They actually vector in a fungus that they feed on in those tunnels that they create. And sometimes you might see staining of that fungus. So in that middle picture, what you can see is when an ambrosia beetle attacks, it will burrow into the bark, just like bark beetles do, but then bark beetles stop there. They don't get into the wood. Ambrosia beetles keep going. So you'll see a hole in the wood, and often around that hole is some staining that's either brown or black. Now, even though they are not tree killers, they can cause defect. And so what I advise is when you're doing harvest to remove the logs off the site as quickly as possible. If you leave them there for a month or two, for example, not only is the material going to kind of break down, a lot of fungus can infest, but these ambrosia beetles will hit those trees and then you'll have more holes in your material. Here is one of those aesthetic pests that I like to mention because I get a lot of calls about it, but it's not one I suggest doing much management for. It's the Sequoia pitch moth. It's a wood borer. It's just a moth, lays its egg in the bark of the tree. Beetle will, or the larva will feed underneath the bark, and a large pitch mass forms over where it's feeding. But that's all that it does. It does not girdle the tree. It's not introducing fungus. It's just a large pitch mass. And often they will hit a tree that's been pruned in spring and summer because they like those attractive smells of that cut material. And if you avoid pruning during that time, that's going to reduce the number of attacks. Once you start getting attacks, they'll keep attacking those trees. I mostly see these in urban landscapes on the west side of the state where people have planted non-native species such as Scots or mugo pine. I don't tend to see it in our native pine. So we typically aren't as concerned with these insects. Next, we have the emerald ash borer, which has not yet entered the state. It is invasive and it has made it as far west as Colorado. We are actively looking for it. If you do see any ash that don't seem to be doing well, and by that meaning the symptoms start with a thinning of the canopy and then the top down dieback, and sometimes you'll have shoots coming out from the bottom, please let us know, or you can report it to Oregon Invasive Hotline or the invader phone number there, and that information is also in the resource document. So very general wood borer management is plant the appropriate species in the appropriate place, remove felled or fire damaged trees quickly to reduce defect from insects such as ambrosia beetle, and then manage for other predisposing stressors such as bark beetles, root disease, fire. Oftentimes the pattern is there's an environmental stressor, bark beetles will come in, and then wood borers follow. And I don't suggest management for the wood borers because, as I mentioned, they're usually the first stage of decomposition, just the natural cycle. Next, we have the defoliators. So as I mentioned, most of the more damaging ones are on the east side and are conifers, but on the west side, we have western tent caterpillar, and you'll see these large webbed tents. Often in alder, I see it a lot of this insect damage a lot in the coastal areas. There's some areas they'll hit repeatedly, but oftentimes it's 1 year of an outbreak. The trees look really bad. They've lost all their leaves, but they will continue to reflush later that year or the next year. It does not kill the tree, even though it looks pretty damaging. Same with webworm. That can get into cottonwood. That's often present in high numbers along the gorge. But again, these trees will rebound. Next, we have the oak looper. And this one is a periodic insect that will have outbreaks that will last for a couple years and then they'll go away. And it's usually in the valley and in white oak. But again, this is a deciduous tree that does not kill buds. The leaves will reflush the next year and there's a little concern. So these are some of the east side insects that we do worry about that are defoliators: western spruce budworm, Douglas fir tussock moth, both primarily problems in Doug fir and true fir, especially in dry areas. Pine butterfly and pine, that's only very rarely periodic. Pandora moth, again, very periodic in pine and only in Central Oregon. And then large case bearer in larch, and that is an exotic. That has been problematic in some areas, but not on the larger scale, and usually just reduces growth rather than kills trees. I do want to mention the gypsy moth, which is also not established here due to the control efforts of Oregon Department of Agriculture. Every year they trap statewide to try and detect populations of gypsy moth that have arrived here from elsewhere, and then they quickly stamp it out with a treatment. So they've been very good about preventing this insect from taking hold here. But this is an insect that does feed on a wide host range, and so we do not want it established here. If you see anything that looks like it, please do let us know at the reporting resources. And what I have circled here, and I'll show you again, this is a tree trunk in which there is an egg mass from gypsy moth, and it's very hard to see until I circle it. Below that, you see a bunch of egg masses on the inside of a tire that has gone, it's a car that's gone through a car wash multiple times, and those egg masses stay firmly in place. So you can see how these insects can get transported into Oregon quite easily. So generally, to manage for defoliators, you want to diversify tree species. Again, it's breaking up the hosts that they can attack, so they can't really go to town on an area. They are more scattered. Remove the tents for any of the caterpillars that will feed inside of a tent. As long as they're present in that tent, you can cut it off, burn it, what have you. But sometimes that can be more damaging to the tree, so I usually suggest you just leave them be. An effective treatment is utilizing Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT, which is a naturally occurring soil bacteria. It's sprayed on foliage early in the feeding stage of the caterpillar. They have to eat it. It does not work if you spray it on their body. They have to consume it because it then affects their digestion. And it will kill the insect very easily. And it's very specific in that it doesn't have a lot of non-targets. So the BT formulated for a caterpillar, for example, will only kill the caterpillars of butterflies and moths, not other insects. So it's a pretty effective product. Lastly, we have the sap-sucking insects. That's the aphids and adelgids and scales. So the spruce aphid is one that we only see periodically. It's an exotic that's been established along our coastal areas in Sitka spruce for quite some time, since the 20s. We did see an outbreak last year where Sitka spruce was looking pretty ragged, because this insect will attack the older foliage, so not the current year because it's too chemically defended, but they'll attack previous years. And sometimes they do so much damage that there's a lot of red needles in the canopy, and then those needles will drop. So the trees can look like they are dead, but the buds are still alive. They will reflush the next year. If you have multiple years of really heavy attacks, then you may see some tree mortality. But luckily, we have had worse cases in the past than we saw last year, far worse in terms of more intensity and more acreage that's been affected. And our Sitka spruce has rebounded from those. And so they definitely will rebound from last year. And I've been checking out on the ground this year, and the outbreak seems to have collapsed. So luckily, we only had 1 year of this insect. So there are some systemic products that can be used for some sucking insects. So you can inject the tree with products that will then travel throughout the tree to the tissues. But oftentimes the way these products work, it takes months for them to translocate through the tree to the foliage. So the tree has to be actively moving product through. So it has to be drinking a lot of water and moving that through to push the product through. So during droughts, systemics are difficult, and they just take a long time to actually move throughout the tree. So they can also be very expensive. So in only rare cases do I suggest utilizing those. Another invasive that's been established in Oregon for quite some time is the balsam woolly adelgid, which attacks true fir. Heaviest is in the Cascades. You may see it in the valley occasionally, especially in Christmas tree farms, but they will cause gouts. And so you often will see little fluffy individuals on the needles, such as in the second picture. And then sometimes some swellings on the branches, such as the third picture. And then in the worst cases that have gone on for multiple years, you'll see abnormally shaped silhouettes of the tree crown because the branches are slowly dying. First the needles drop off, then the twigs die back, and then the whole branch will drop off. And so you'll have an abnormal asymmetrical crown. There isn't a lot of control performed for this insect because in the Cascades, it's hard to get to those areas. So we have to rely on any natural enemies that we have that can go after that insect. Next, we have the black pine leaf scale. I mostly see this as a problematic pest in pines, particularly neighboring orchards, the cherry, pear systems in the gorge, where a lot of pesticides are applied and will reduce the number of parasitic wasps. Then we'll have a negative effect on adjacent pine that have these scales that are controlled by those wasps. So even reducing the pesticide load for a year or two, or changing to a less broad spectrum pesticide treatment, or changing the timing of that treatment, can have a marked effect where you see the number of natural enemies increase the year or two after or altering your pesticide application regime, and then you'll see a drop in scale thereafter. Very common. So lastly, I do have a couple of slides just showing these major pests by host. I also listed them for diseases, but this information can also be found in one of the resource guides on our website, or on the Tree School website that I included. And we also have a lot of resources on our Forest Health site, on Oregon Department of Forestry site. I did want to plug some new work we're doing with bees and forestry. There is a bees class at Tree School, so if you're not already taking that, check that out future years. But we will provide more guidance in the future on how we can manage for wild bees, not just honeybees in our landscapes, because forests have been proven to be a great reservoir for bees. So we want to promote that. So here are some of your resources. We have Oregon Department of Forestry unit offices with stewardship foresters at all of the green trees. And at the orange dots are the Oregon State University Forestry Extension people, and these people are here to serve you. They're here to answer your questions. Often they're the first line of answering your silvicultural questions, but also your forest health questions, and we are in constant communication with them. They're familiar with a lot of the major insects and diseases that we call pests, but they do reach out to us if there's anything that requires additional troubleshooting. So we have a great relationship with them. And with that, we're all done. So I'll open it up for questions.
Great. Well, we do have a number of good questions still binned up, and please continue to post those. We'll hang around even a little after the formal conclusion to try to answer all of them. I'm going to go ahead and throw up for everybody the wrap-up poll here and allow folks to answer that. And just real quick before we get to the questions, Christine, if you wouldn't mind just showing that last slide. I just want to mention to everybody next week, it was there and then it disappeared.
Oh, which one? Which slide?
Their final slide, the next one showing next week's
there we go.
classes. There we go. Whoop.
I'll fix it.
So Christine will be back next week to talk about bees. That was something that she just started to touch on at the end of her presentation. And Sarah Navarro will also be joining us to talk about, and I don't want to get it wrong, so I'm going to wait for it to show up.
Sorry. I'm getting there. Good.
Here it comes.
There we go.
She's going to be talking about managing root and butt rot in conifers. So that's next Tuesday morning, and then in the afternoon, Christine will be back. And if you're interested in those, you can register for them again at no charge at knowyourforest.org. So thanks all for filling out that poll. I'm going to go ahead and close it. And we'll pivot over to some of the great questions that I know have populated here. So on the topic of root and butt rot in conifers, I know there was a question in here, let me find it, asking about thinning for bark beetle mitigation. Could this exacerbate root disease problems? And if so, is there any way you could thin that would not exacerbate those issues?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different types of root diseases, and some of them can be easily transported by equipment. So anytime you have some soil attaching to equipment, those fungal spores will be in that soil and it could be spread around your stand. So it really depends on the type of root disease that you are working with, because they do work in different ways. So first you want to know which one you are managing for. Additionally, if you are doing thinning, any sort of thinning is going to be useful because it increases the amount of water available to the trees. Root disease affects how the trees can pull in the water. So if you're increasing water, that can help, especially if you have some trees that have some root disease. But really what's most important is the sanitation of the site. So you really want to be aware of what root disease get into the host trees that you are managing, and therefore how can you potentially spread that root disease around the stand to avoid that happening.
Let's see, so we've got a few different slash management questions. Maybe we can knock a couple of those out. So if one question is, if slash is not managed properly, sort of, how far away is the impact? So in this particular case, it sounds like this person is about 3 miles or so away from a site that maybe has a lot of slash. So kind of, what's the concern in terms of, the impact from slash and an adjoining property?
Well, bark beetles can smell at quite a distance. So those volatiles really travel. They don't like to fly very far. They can fly 3 miles, no problem. But if they don't really know that there is a food source at the end of that 3 miles, they're probably not going to chance it. So 3 miles is pretty far for you to create slash and to attract bark beetles from a distance. So I wouldn't be as concerned as within a half mile or maybe even stretching to 1 mile. So I'm really, I want to be careful here because bark beetles definitely can travel very far, especially if wind aided, but they aren't often in large number picking up and just moving to another area unless they know there's a resource there. So it's a smell they're attracted to, but also realize they need to visually see trees. They're not going to fly from, let's say you have a slash pile here that they're attracted to, and then you have an open field, and then there's some trees beyond that. They need to visually see a whole bunch of column structures because that signifies food. They're not going to just travel through a field. That doesn't look like food to them. So 3 miles is pretty far. I wouldn't be as concerned about that.
So they're looking for a close meal, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And then still continuing on the theme of slash, this person asking just to confirm that if the thinning and the creation of the slash is completed around October and it's left in the forest, that's probably okay?
Yes.
Question mark at the end?
Yes. So what happens is the material dries out or it gets really damp in the winter and just breaks down because they need that phloem and cambium to be fresh, intact. They don't need it to be broken down. And so October through December is a very small window because you have to do it way in advance. So leaving it on the ground is perfectly safe. If you can scatter it, even better. I know that's not always possible. That's a lot of labor that's added. But if you leave the slash on the ground in October, provided it's not a fuels risk, you're perfectly fine doing that. The beetles will not get into it. Now you said completing that work. So I want to be clear, if you start doing your work in June, or let's say August, and you finish in October, that material that was created in August, there could be another population that is pushed out of that. So starting and finishing the work in October through December, that's the window you have to work in. It's very short, but that's how you can ensure that that material will not be attacked in April.
And then another question, again, about slash management. sounds like this person is planning to cut down about 25 trees that have been killed by ips. And they're concerned about how to manage. So if they, I guess I would ask, should they be concerned about any remaining beetles emerging from these trees? And if so, for those things that they're not able to chip, they're thinking about solarizing it with plastic, and how long should that plastic stay to help kill out the beetles?
So it depends on when those trees died. Now remember, if the tree needles are red, the beetles have probably left. So you'd want to look for little exit holes to make sure they're gone. If you see those little exit holes, those trees are no longer at risk. They are not containing beetles, nor are they going to attract additional bark beetles. So you can leave them standing for wildlife unless you want to get them out of there. So that's not a concern. So really make sure you know what has been attacked. Remember, I mentioned the red trees looking to the next adjacent green tree. You want to see if those are infested. Look for frass in that material. If you see frass and no exit holes, you'd want to get those out of there. It's also really important to note that ips, unfortunately, because they like smaller diameter material, if your trees are larger, that smaller diameter material is at the top or it's in branches. So it's really hard to see. But it's usually pretty safe that if the trees have been red, for a while, they didn't just turn red a couple months ago, then they could still be in the tree, but typically they will leave very soon. So what's the timing of that? That's really important. Solarizing is a little tricky, even though it is a potential management technique. What it is basically is you have all of your slash material covered by plastic, and it's clear plastic, and it cooks the material. Also, the beetles will come out of it because they'll see the light, and they're trying to go through the plastic. And so they come out of the material and they're more exposed to the heat, and so they get cooked. A lot of those experiments showing solarization was effective were done in the American Southwest, where it's much hotter. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we just don't get it hot enough to where solarization can provide a chamber of long-term cooking temperature for the beetles. So I don't usually suggest it. I think it's a lot more trouble than it's worth. Additionally, these beetles chew through wood, they can chew through plastic. So if they're not getting cooked properly, they're just going to chew right through that plastic and your effort is wasted.
All right. Cooking the insects. Let's see here. There's a couple of questions related to attracting and kind of creating conditions for a diversity of insects and you know, particularly kind of friendly insects. If you have any suggestions or advice around, you know, management strategies for doing that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the biggest things that we can do is not sanitizing the site too much. So now remember, if there's any sort of fuels risk, we don't want you to create another problem. But the insects that are most beneficial for controlling are birds. In addition, other types of insects that are direct predators, so other types of beetles that will go under the bark and they'll feed on these insects, or parasitic wasps and flies. Now those insects are often ignored because they're so tiny and you often don't see them on the landscape unless you're really actively looking for them, but they're present in high number and they're very important. And they tend to like to hang out in any sort of debris on the ground, any sort of understory plants, they kind of rest underneath that. And so don't sanitize the forest floor. Leave some of that material out there. That's going to be the most beneficial thing that you can do. And creating any sort of more natural, holistic habitat where you have a wide diversity of not only different tree and plant species, but also the ages are varied. So you have a multi-level canopy because that's going to create a lot more opportunity for nesting for a lot more different types of wildlife that provide control.
Well, we're in the final leg here. We got a few questions left. This has been pretty intense. Lots of great information as always. So this next one is just a question about if you have any updates on research into what's been killing western red cedar. Maybe you can give a little context around that for folks too.
Yes, thank you for including that. I did not put a slide in because I had a pretty packed presentation, but we are actively researching western red cedar decline pockets. So this is, if you aren't aware of it, I'm sure you'll see it, and I'm sorry to do this to you because you can't not see it now, and it makes it pretty sad looking around at western red cedar on our landscape. So from Oregon all the way through Western Canada, there are pockets of western red cedar that are dying back. We're not sure why. They're often in areas where western red cedar should be thriving. So they have a nice closed canopy, so they're not getting beat down on by the sun. They're right next to streams, so they're getting that moisture that they need, but they are dying back. How it typically occurs is the first symptom you'll see is a thinning canopy. So you'll see one crown looking less full than another, for example. Sometimes yellowing, sometimes there's some branch or top dieback, but that's usually the main symptoms you're seeing is the thinning of the crown. Then that tree will turn red in the same or the next year. You'll see the next tree, next western red cedar next to it, start having a thinning crown, and then you have this little pocket of mortality. It's really common in public spaces, so park areas. I see it in school lots, small woodlands. I haven't seen it in industrial areas yet, but we are also only seeing it in Oregon, mostly in the northwest corner, whereas our partners up north, such as Washington, are seeing it in their western red cedar on the east side as well, because they do have pockets of western red cedar out there. So what we've done is we have a Forest Service grant that we got to investigate it. And what we're asking from all landowners, land managers, and the general public is help us with identifying where these pockets are, because we cannot identify it easily in aerial survey. It's really hard to see from the plane. And so we are relying on ground reports. So if you can send us, and you can send them to me directly, any location information so that I can directly walk to that pocket. So what I mean by that is the nearest intersection if it's in an urban area, or the lat long. I need something a little bit more than a township. I need to know exactly where it is on the ground. Therein, I will visit it, I will map it, and then we will set up some plots in which we're taking various measurements to see if we can define any patterns that are shared amongst these dieback sites. What we think is happening, though, is that even though there is still moisture at these sites, you'll see pockets right along creeks where water is still running. They are not as full as they once were. So we think it might be climate driven, that even though these trees are getting moisture, it's not what they were used to, and perhaps they're getting more sun exposure than they're used to. So we think it might be climate driven. We're not sure. We are also enlisting the help of folks to do tree ring analyses and also do some soil sampling to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, there's one just a couple of blocks from my house here. Maybe I'll send you a message and let you know where it's at.
Thank you. Yes, please do.
Yeah.
We do have a fact sheet about that. Everything I talked about today, we have fact sheets online. Please check them out, because I know I ran through a lot of material, so there's more there. And there is one on western red cedar. Please share it with people, because the more people we have with their eyes on the ground, the better we're going to be able to map and investigate this.
So here's a question about giant sequoia. The person writing the question says that she's got a row, it's a windbreak of about 50 trees on her farm, and a number of them started showing top die-off about 7 years ago. Actually, now she's saying more than half of them are showing top die-off, that the lower branches are still green and thriving, and wondering if you have any idea what that might be in giant sequoia.
Yeah, so sequoia is, again, one of those that we really like because it is pretty insect and disease resistant. Oftentimes when I see damage in sequoia, usually it's along a roadside and it's due to chemical spray. So any sort of application of herbicide, they tend to pick it up pretty easily. When you have top dieback, that usually means something has damaged the roots, or it's drought stressed because water can't go all the way to the top, so the top starts dying back. So you might have a drought situation, especially because sequoia is very shallow rooted. The reason they don't fall over easily is because they interconnect their roots if they're living communally, but they don't have a huge tap root. And so they aren't reaching very far for moisture. And so that you could have a drought stress situation where they've just passed this threshold of having enough moisture at that site to be a large enough tree. The lucky thing with sequoia, even though it is a visual eyesore to see top dieback, sequoia also suckers from the bottom. So you could have other stems coming up to replace those in the future because they do grow very fast. But also top dieback in sequoia does not mean it will die. As in other conifers, oftentimes when the tip dies back, the rest of the tree will die back. But sequoia often, especially when it gets older, the tops regularly get damaged by any sort of storm damage, sometimes top crown fires, and the tree will persist, and it will just have kind of a forked-like top. So I wouldn't be as concerned, but if you are seeing some yellowing foliage too, you might have an herbicide issue, especially if it's along the roadside, but I'm leaning more towards it's probably a drought issue, and you can just let it ride.
All right, we have got a couple more that have come in here. So I'm going to bounce back real quick to Western red cedar, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce all of this that's in here, but I'll do my best. Maybe you can see it, Christine. Are the Western red cedar also being impacted by leaf blight from the Didymocella thuyina fungus?
Yeah, so, you know, Western red cedar does have various rusts and foliar fungi, but most of those types of diseases are only aesthetic, or they will only perk up when the conditions are really moist, because you'll have like a closed stand and that moisture gets trapped and fungus thrives in moisture. But typically those are not problematic tree killers. So we have not found evidence. We've been doing intensive, along with OSU in Washington, we've been doing intensive sampling for any sort of diseases that might be present, and nothing has been consistently identified. So we have some pockets that have no disease present, some that might have one disease present, but nothing ever relating to foliage. So that would not be a contributing factor as far as we know right now.
And then a question about a 250-year-old plus hemlock that this person would like to protect, if you had any suggestions specifically for that.
I'm not sure which suggestions in terms of just keeping it alive. If it's been doing well, you know, there's nothing you need to do. As somebody mentioned earlier, any sort of changing the water table or diverting irrigation, that's going to impact the hemlock because they are not very drought tolerant. So any sort of preventative steps to changing how much moisture that tree is getting is really important. But other than that, in terms of insect and disease, there really isn't a whole lot. If it's not already being attacked at that age, that tree is going to make it for the long term. That hemlock is very insect and disease resistant, and once you get into old growth, they've usually made it out of the window where they're most susceptible, and they're just kind of living out the remaining years.
And then last but not least, question about big leaf maple dieback, if there's any updates on causes there.
Yeah, so we actually have a new fact sheet that's going to be going on our website soon about the big leaf maple. Again, that's a head scratcher. And we've been working with Washington because they're seeing it as well. What we don't know is there anything climate related that is impacting it? But observationally, we have seen that even though big leaf maple is a pretty drought tolerant tree and can live on a wide variety of different spaces, even in poor soils, they tend to be doing worse on the drier or rocky soils during this time when we're seeing that dieback. There has been some investigation as to whether there are some diseases that are being transmitted to the trees through a sap-sucking insect. We have seen some evidence of that, but it's not been consistent. And so again, we can't say that we've seen this pattern repeat itself over and over. So we can't point our fingers to that, but it may be a contributing factor in some areas. Other diseases, such as root diseases that they've investigated, we have not found consistent species at these different sites. Some have no root diseases, but we're not finding one species everywhere or even a handful. So we don't know where to go with that. It could be, again, even though this is a pretty drought tolerant tree, that in some areas they're reaching their threshold level of how much drought they can withstand, and they're not making it. But we do have a fact sheet. The Forest Service is looking into it. Both state departments in Oregon and Washington are looking into it. We're all talking with each other. We're trying to figure it out. We put some of these fact sheets online to let you know where it stands and where we're going with it. And then we'll give you updates once we have found something out. But as of right now, we're leaning towards climate, but not quite sure. And I see the next question, the best resource for consulting foresters. So that map that I showed has all the unit offices, and the links next to it will show you the actual location, so the addresses and the names of the people that you're going to want to connect with for OSU Forest Extension, and then ODF Stewardship Foresters. And then if you are asking for actual consulting foresters to do some work for you, they will also know some of the people that work in their area that are pretty dependable or recommendable. So really look at some of these resources that we provide for you on our ODF Forest Health site, because we do show how to find technical assistance and also fact sheets and information, status updates on what we're seeing year to year. That's all available if you just look on the website. And you can always reach out to us individually. This is our job to provide technical troubleshooting for you.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Christine. That was, as always, a wonderful presentation and a lot of information in a pretty short period of time. I know the background crew here, there was a lot of text message exchange around the beetle with the chainsaw jaws. We really enjoyed that as well. That's a good fun fact. Yeah.
Got to lighten it up a little bit.
Right. Well, again, thank you. And thank you all for joining us for this Tree School Online webinar, and join us again next Tuesday, and hope you all have a great evening.
Great. Thank you so much. Goodbye.